Thank you so much for joining us today. This is the Member Lounge podcast. And if you don't know me, I'm Farhad Khan. I'm the CEO of Member Lounge. And our app Member Lounge is a membership management system. And it's one of your quickest ways to build an engaging membership website for your membership. With Member Lounge, you can take your membership marketing on autopilot so that member engagement just happens without you having to work hard for it. You can see a demo of our platform Member Lounge on our website at memberlounge.app. That is Member Lounge, all one word, .app. This is the live recording of our podcast episode. If you're joining us live today, welcome. We're also streaming this live on YouTube. We got some amazing questions from the audience already from when you registered, so we're going to answer some of them. But if you have any more questions during the episode, please submit them on Zoom questions. Today, we are excited to have Jeff Cagna with us, and we will talk about board stewardship. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us today. Can you start by telling us a bit about yourself and your work?
Sure. Well, thanks, Farhad. I appreciate you and Annika for having me on the show, and happy to have this conversation. So I've been working in the association community for more than 30 years. The first 10 of those were spent as association staff. I'm now in my 23rd year as a consultant, advisor, speaker. I have spoken on many occasions in Canada for the Canadian Society of Association Executives. I've done work with the Canadian associations. So very happy to be speaking to an audience that is in Canada, but obviously it's online as well. So anywhere people are watching can hear it. And my work is really with association boards, and also by extension with CEOs and senior teams and their staff partners, trying to help them set a higher standard of stewardship, governing, and foresight.
Got it. So Jeff, what is the biggest challenge you're trying to solve with the boards?
Well, it's really a performance issue, and it's a systemic, performance issue. It's everything that goes into how boards perform and whether or not they are fit for purpose for the challenges before them. I think that we tend to we have historically tended to focus on, well, the board is the problem, and I actually think it's the whole system around the board that is the problem. So we have to work on shifting the system and helping those who are serving on the board, as well as those working with the board, to understand why these shifts need to be made, and really rethink for the rest of this decade into the 2030s and beyond, rethink what the purpose of the board is, what the work of the board is, and how the board can best function in this environment, which is obviously quite challenging as we look ahead for the rest of this decade and beyond.
Yeah, so you have worked with many boards in the past to improve their performance overall. So, what do you do?
Well, I think the way I work with association boards is really to first understand what the issues are. I mean, I don't think it's pretty much what any consultant would do, is try to understand better from the chief executive officer and from the board chair, and from the board itself through a survey work, try to understand what are the issues, how do they see their work, how do they see themselves, what are the orthodox beliefs that exist within the board and within the association and within the field, the profession or industry, and how can we better understand the impact of that orthodoxy on what they're doing, and have a conversation with them, teasing out, really unpacking the detrimental impact of that orthodoxy, and then also giving them a different way of thinking about what they do. Again, different, distinctive from what they have historically felt. I mean, it is not entirely dissimilar. It's not completely far afield. It's just really helping them sort of lean toward the future. I think a lot of what we tell boards, a lot of what we have taught boards over many years, is ways of thinking that are better grounded in the past. And so that's the reason for the confrontation with orthodoxy, is we've got to get them out of thinking that what they're doing today can be just like what predecessor boards did. Instead, have them thinking more about, how do we lean their work? How do we reorient their work toward the future? And what do they need to be able to adapt, to anticipate, to operate in that future? And so that's a really critical shift, I think, in the thinking and in the conversation that we have. So again, we start with orthodoxy. It's always the toughest conversation to have. And we can certainly talk more about why that is. But I think that the fundamental issue is once we initiate that conversation around orthodoxy, how do we get them to think and orient their approach to where they're headed, which is the crucial shift that every board has to make.
So I guess, Jeff, in general, we try to recruit the best board members. They are very intellectual people. They actually have like lots of experience, like coming from their past, right? So, like, why are we not able to like get over the orthodoxies overall? Like, why do you think, and what do we need to do better?
Well, I mean, I think actually, ideally, in an ideal scenario, we are trying to assemble with intention the very best possible board for our
Mm,
organizations. But that is not always the way it happens, right? Because one of the orthodox
mm,
beliefs that exist around boards is that we have to elect boards, right? So we have to have an electoral process that sometimes involves a campaign, which is, to me, the worst possible way to compose an association board. The idea that we're going to elect a board, people are going to campaign for it, even lightly campaign for it. There are so many problems inherent in that approach that it doesn't really allow us to be intentional about pulling together. We can try to do that, but ultimately it's left up to a relatively small number. Typically speaking, it's a relatively small number of often low information voters who are making that choice.
yeah.
And so I think we have to have a more intentional process for creating our boards, the one that is more rigorous and more attuned to getting the best possible people to be on the board, who are the 12, 15, 20 people who are best equipped to do this and go through a process to identify and select them for this service. But I think to the rest of your question, I think the reason why we can't get over, our orthodoxy, and just to be clear about what we're talking about, our orthodox beliefs are the deep-seated assumptions we make about how the world works. We all have orthodoxies that we hold. Every organization has orthodoxies. Every board has orthodoxies. And the orthodox beliefs that we hold are so deep-seated that they are basically invisible to us. And so we can't really easily identify them. We just know that they're there, or perhaps we don't even know that they're there. And they still form a basis for how we make decisions in our organizations, even over all these many years and decades that they've been around. So it's really important, for us to recognize that, because they are inherent in the system. That's what I meant earlier, or at least a part of what I meant earlier, when I was saying I think the system is the problem, because the system operates, at least in part, or perhaps even mostly, on the flow of orthodox beliefs that exists out there in the organization, again, in the profession, among the members, and certainly among board members themselves. And so, that is a feature, that is an element of every board and every
Mm.
organization. We've got to overcome those challenges, but it's very hard unless you are intentional and focused on doing so. It's an ongoing process. It doesn't stop. You have to really move the conversation away from orthodoxy and toward different ways of thinking, which is what I try to do, as part of the work that I do.
Got it, got it. And I guess in general, what got us to this level today will not take us to the next level. So whatever practices we had before in the past, like the team and everything else, that will not take us to the next level. So we have to like build our current team and everything for the future. If you're not able to do that, our structure, our processes for the future, then we're going to like stay stuck in the past. So you
Yeah.
mentioned the duty of foresight for boards and it being so important. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, and just before I get to the duty of foresight, I just want to comment on what you said, and I agree with it 100%. I just wanted to amplify it a little bit and say, the way that I like to talk about this, there are a variety of phrases that I use to describe this for people, and the what I would say about what you just said is the idea that association boards must become more, right? More than they have been historically, more than they are today, more than they imagine that they can be. We have to help them see that we need them to be more, that they can be more, and that's what I mean by being fit for purpose. Like, we can elevate their performance, but they have to be willing partners, and everyone has to be a part of that process. Now, core to the idea of all of this, and I know as part of our conversation we'll talk more specifically about stewardship, governing, and foresight, but which is the approach, the methodology that I use. Um, that is really the centerpiece of the methodology, the duty of foresight, because it ties together all of the elements, all three elements of stewardship, governing, and foresight. And what I'm excited about in 2024 is that this is the 10-year milestone of the article in which I first wrote about the duty of foresight. I came in 2014 in ASAE's Associations Now magazine, ASAE, American Society of Association Executives, and that article was actually written about BlackBerry in a sense, because it actually emerged from my research on BlackBerry, because I was writing an article in 2014 in which I was trying to understand why a company that had such tremendous success lost that success. How could that happen? And one of the conclusions that I drew in my work in writing that article was that the BlackBerry board, Research in Motion Becoming BlackBerry, had really failed at a duty of foresight to imagine a world in which its business model, the company's business model, would not be the dominant business model, and in which consumer preferences would change, in which new competitors would emerge. They had failed at that, and I realized at that time that this was an important discussion for association boards to have, because if it could happen to a company like BlackBerry, which, as you know, back in the day was not just the most important mobile handset manufacturer, was probably the most important technology company in the world at its time, a cultural phenomenon in many ways, and with the whole idea of crackberries and that sort of thing. And so it went from being that to being everyone having a BlackBerry. And I was a very loyal customer of the company. I had many BlackBerry devices over a period of years, which is why I chose it, because I wanted to understand what happened. And that shift away from being this dominant player to now, it still exists as a company, but only as a security software company. It's not something we talk about anymore. It's lost everything that it once had. How could that happen? And this lack of foresight, the failure of the board to perform, what I thought was a fundamental responsibility, was really the problem. So in these last 10 years, I have written about and talked about the duty of foresight with association boards, and shared these perspectives, helped them adopt the duty of foresight. And so in 2024, my intention is to, this process of talking about in 2024 and marking this milestone is not a celebration. It's not a celebration of me. It's not a celebration of the idea. It's really an attempt to remind people the importance of foresight in this environment. We've learned some very hard lessons in the last few years as a consequence of a global health emergency for which we were not prepared, even though it was foreseeable. And we were still learning those lessons, and they're painful lessons. So we've learned enough to know that we need to be doing this better. And so it's a reminder of where we are, and it's an invitation, a renewed invitation to association boards across our community, both in Canada, the United States, and around the world, to take seriously the idea that their organizations need to be more anticipatory, more adaptive, to better prepare themselves for the full range of issues that are certain to emerge, have already emerged in this decade, and will continue to emerge as we look ahead and into the 2030s. So for me, the duty of foresight is the most important thing that I've done in my career to try to help associations and their boards prepare for the future, and to think differently about the role that they play in making that happen.
So do you have a process to kind of like follow the duty of foresight? Is there like a step-by-step method or a structure?
Well, the short answer is there's no step-by-step method.
Yeah.
It doesn't, board development and the work that we do, it doesn't really work in that way. But there is the methodology of stewardship, governing, and foresight. And it's the integration of those three ideas around the duty of foresight as kind of the central notion that that boards would adopt. And it really encapsulates the three ideas of stewardship, which I define as a shared commitment to leave the system better than how we found it, for the benefit of stakeholders and successors. And I use the word system there because it's not just the association, right? An association is a system. It's a system of people. It's a system of relationships. But the association itself is not the only system for which boards have responsibility. They also have, they share some responsibility working in a particular professional or industry ecosystem. So their decisions affect others who operate within their particular space. They often enter into collaborative relationships with other organizations or stakeholders for which they have a role. So I choose to use the word system here. It applies specifically to associations but it's a reminder that there's not just one system in play here. And the focus of stewardship really has to be on the long term. So how do we benefit not only those of today, which of course remains important, but how do we benefit our successors, and really how do we help them move forward? How do we give them every opportunity to be successful in the future, just as surely as we had hoped for ourselves? The governing aspect, so that's kind of the commitment that I ask of boards, and there's more to say about that. I'm happy to talk about if anyone wants to go into it further. But then there's the governing component, right, which is really about how does a board govern in a little differently and think about its governing role in the context of stewardship. And then the foresight aspect is really how do we make sure that we're always looking forward, and how do we propose to put our emphasis on where we're headed versus where we've been. And so the connection among all those three is embedded in the idea of the duty of foresight, which the way I define it now is it really requires boards to stand up for their successors' futures through intentional learning, short-term sacrifice, and long-term action. And all of those ideas are really tied together through, they tie together the notion of why we have a foundation of stewardship, how we have to think differently about governing, and how we have to learn with the future to enable our organizations to be adaptive and anticipatory in a very challenging environment. So that's the approach that I take. And then depending on the individual association, depending on the orthodoxies that emerge, I'll use different approaches. And it's all, one final thing I'll add, is it's all based on next practices. So the whole process, all the work is based on the idea that we can develop whatever practices the board needs to make, and the staff need to make these challenges that they face more manageable, right? So we put in practices. The duty of foresight itself is a next practice, and there can be other practices, some of which I've developed, some of which I work with the organization to develop for themselves, so that they can design governing and design the whole process for how they need it to be, so that it's not limited by what we've been told. It's not limited by orthodoxy. It's only limited by the fundamental requirements of third-party organizations, governments, and other entities that are concerned about our work. As long as we're satisfying their requirements, then we can make this be whatever we want it to be. And so next practices are an important part of making this something we can implement, and not only shift the mindset associated with it, but also shift the structures and mechanics of how organizations function.
So we got so many questions from the audience, like asking about board engagement. So maybe like a typical board will meet only like 6 times a year. So how do you, and then like for a short period of time, so how do you truly actually get the board engaged like the entire year, and then like get the most from the meetings that you're having?
Yeah. So I saw a number of questions that were shared with me ahead of time, and that's why I thought it best for us to kind of talk about it as a big topic, because first of all, engagement's not my favorite word. I'll start there. I think that because it implies somehow that it's a choice. When a board is organized, when a board is composed, there is a clear statement being made that one is going to serve on that board, right? But let me broaden it out from there to say I don't think that the issue of board participation or involvement is just on the board. It's a systemic issue, just as surely as the issues that I'm talking about are a systemic challenge that we have to address. I think the issue of how boards perform and the work that they do is a systemic issue. So it starts, the issues that people have with boards not being as active as they would like them to be don't begin at the meeting. They begin at selection, right? They begin at identifying who the board is going to be. That's why I said earlier that elections are the worst possible way to compose a board, because you just don't know what you're going to get from the participants, from the people who are seeking board service. You need to be able to evaluate people more rigorously beyond, the voting process. Now, some organizations do have a nominations process where they will then put up a slate of directors and officers that'll be voted on, and that's a little bit better. But ultimately, I would prefer a more rigorous selection process led by a nominating committee or a board development committee or a governance committee to be able to get the right people, and to also go through the work of developing them even before they are seated on the board. So the thing to keep in mind is, a couple of things to keep in mind. First, I think it's important to remember that board service is not a volunteer role, right? It's voluntary. And the difference is that, besides there's a legal difference there that often exists, that volunteers in an association or in any organization that has volunteers generally do not have fiduciary responsibility for the organization. They don't have specific fiduciary duties that go along with their
Mm,
involvement on a committee or on a chapter, in a chapter event or something like that. Whereas boards do. Boards have fiduciary responsibilities. So there's some legal and other distinctions between what it means to be a volunteer versus serving on a board. But the real issue here is that no one ends up on boards by accident, right? Like board selection, everyone gets there because they choose it, right? You either choose it because you've been asked, hey, we'd like for you to run for the board. I'll say, sure, yeah, I'd run for the board. Hey, guess what? You've been put on the slate to run for the board. Great. Oh, guess what? You've been voted in. You get asked repeatedly, like you have to reinforce your choice multiple times along the way. And so every time you say yes, you're saying, yes, I'm here and I'm going to do it, but it's voluntary. You've chosen it, right? And you can choose not to be there if you don't want to be there. So my point in bringing this up is that when we look at, the issue of how boards perform, it starts with selection. It starts with getting people prepared. It continues once they are on with making sure that they have work that is worthy of their time, attention, energy, and
mm,
talent. I think that a big issue is that we do not put particularly interesting work in front of the boards. I think we have to reimagine what it is that boards do. And that's really what I'm trying to do with the work that I'm involved with around stewardship, governing, and foresight, is to shift the work of the board into these more critical issues around what does the future look like for our industries and professions? What are plausible futures? How do we guide the organization away from those we don't want? How do we guide it toward the ones that are more favorable for us? That's the more important work of boards. It's the work really that they alone can do. And some of the other things we ask boards to do can either be done by other groups, or we can minimize the amount of time they have to spend on them so we can maximize their attention for other conversations. So I think we have to look at the issue of board engagement, quote unquote, as a systemic issue that requires multiple solutions. It's not, we can't, there's no way to get a board to do anything. Like I don't go into boardrooms and try to get them to do anything. I invite them to look at things in a different way. There's no sort of quick fix. We can't trick boards into doing things. We have to be able to have a serious conversation that looks at the entire picture of how boards function and ask harder questions. What are we doing to seat the right people? How do we develop those people once they're seated? What work do we give them when they're serving on the board? What do we as staff, when I was staff, what do I as a CEO, what does a staff person need to do to make sure the information that they're being provided is useful to their decision making? How do we make sure we're not wasting their time with administrivia and
mm.
trivialities that are not really appropriate for them? So it has to be a holistic view around how we address the issue, not simply how do we get these. And by the way, time is not an excuse. Busyness is not an excuse. I don't know anyone serving on any board who isn't busy, right? And by the way, when you were asked, when people were asked if they wanted to be on the board, they were busy then too. So they weren't not busy. They didn't add board service to their menu because they were looking for something to do, right? No one who is accomplished or interested in this kind of thing in board service would ever say, hey, you know what? I think I've got this open slot of multiple hours in my schedule. Let me add a board to my list. People do it for different reasons. We have to give them the best possible reason to do it, which is that they're serving their association, serving their profession or industry. And there's more reasons beyond that I go into in the work that I do. But ultimately, this is a multifaceted problem that we have to look at from every angle so that we can really address it systemically rather than just saying, well, we've got busy people around the room. How can we reformat a document to make them be more engaged? That's not going to be a solution.
Got it. Got it. Now, I guess like this question came up again and again. So I just want to ask this like upfront, like, so how do you actually keep the board members engaged, like in between the meetings? Like, do you have a process or any practice that has worked in the past?
Well, again, it goes back to what I was saying before, and there's no trick to it.
Yeah.
It's really a matter of the board itself needs to really have that conversation, right?
Got it.
what are we going to do in between meetings? And by the way, I heard you say, 6 times a year. That's way too many meetings for a board, right? No board needs to meet more than, I would say, 4 times a year.
Mm,
And three would be better, right? I mean, they don't need to have that many meetings. I mean, I was on the board of ASAE back in the day. At that time, back, probably about 14 years ago was when I retired from that board. At the time, it was a $35 million organization. We met 3 times a year in person. One of those was at the annual meeting, one in the fall, and then one in the spring period. 3 times was enough for a full day, right? A full day meeting.
mm,
So having 6 half-day meetings is not really a great use of time because you can't do anything of real substance in that period. So 3 or 4 meetings. When I was a board chair, I was a $3 million organization. We had 4 meetings per year. One of those was virtual. 3 of them were in person. I thought even that was probably a lot for such an organization of such a small size. Most organizations are not large enough to really merit more than 3 meetings per year. Maybe some might need 4, but beyond that, you don't need to do it. So if you're talking about maybe 3 to 4 meetings per year, that means you're in between, your spaces in between meetings should be periods of information sharing and learning for the board. So what did we talk about at meeting 1? And then we have meeting 2, maybe 3 or 4 months later. What is it we need to make sure the board is talking about and learning about in between meeting 1 and meeting 2? And in between meeting 2 and meeting 3, maybe we drop in a Zoom session for a conversation in between those meetings. But we have to design it in such a way so that we know whatever happens at meeting 1, let's make sure we have sufficient follow-up in between meeting 1 and meeting 2 so that there's a conversation to be had. Make sure we provide, follow-up report or follow-up, data that is requested, and make sure that they're having that discussion so that you're setting up. Use these periods in between to set up the next in-person meeting in meeting 2 and then later meeting 3. And you can obviously adjust it if you're thinking about 4 meetings. But I think that's the way you have to do it. The board itself too has to have that conversation. I think another way to approach this is I think in most associations, the secretary role is underused. The secretary, it really should be the chief information officer for the board. They should work with the board to better understand what the board is looking for in terms of how information should be shared. Are we talking about only providing documents? Are we talking about doing things with video? Should we be doing visualization? Should we be doing infographics? What would be the best way to communicate information to the board? The secretary can work with the chief staff executive and with other staff stakeholders to figure out the best way to share information with the board. So I think there's a variety of approaches you can take, but again, it's part of that larger issue, right? Of how do we make sure that it's not just people participating in meetings or being, in the meetings, but also how do they work together in between? And of course, the other thing, and one final point, if there are committees that involve the board members, then that is often, the best way to make sure there's committee meetings and sessions in between meetings, so that in between board meetings, so that the committees can be doing their work and bring to the next scheduled board meeting whatever the committee has to do or has to report. And structuring committee submissions in really 3 ways. I talk a lot about board ready information and the importance of board ready information. And one of the aspects of board ready information is making sure that your committees know how to present their submissions to the board, and to also set an expectation that the board will respond to those submissions in a timely fashion. And really, there are only 3 kinds of submissions that every committee would provide to a board, right? You're either submitting a recommendation, submitting a report, or submitting a request, right? A recommendation for the board to act on, a report on some issue that the committee thinks is important, or perhaps responding to a request from the board itself. And then a request is usually some kind of request for funding or some other request that the committee might make. Those are really the 3 ways that committees would communicate with a board. And so structuring those submissions according to what the submission is about, what its purpose is, will facilitate a better decision-making process by the board, a better response by the board. So I think those are some things you can do. But again, look at the issue as being part of a larger picture, a larger holistic solution that has to be put in place for ensuring that everyone, board, staff, committees, all stakeholders are working together to ensure that there's a continuous flow of activity during and between board meetings over the course of any given calendar year, and reduce the number of meetings to facilitate that process. Because I've always believed that 1 hour, for every 1 hour board meeting, there's at least 5 hours of preparation time, right?
Mm.
So you want to make sure that those meetings are useful. If you have 6 meetings per year that go for half a day, that's 24 hours of meetings. That's a lot of preparation time. And I think you can make better use of that, even though it's the same. If you have 3 8-hour meetings, you can make better use of that preparation time if you have a longer period of time to be able to have those conversations, and you can better focus the board's work in important ways. So there's different ways to approach it, but I think each organization needs to find what works for them.
You touched on something very important, I guess, that like for every 1 hour of meeting, there is like 5 hours of preparation time. So we were working with an association like very recently, and then what they were saying is that we have to present this to the board, and then like in the board, like we're going to like talk about it, and then like go through the whole process. So that actually like reminded me that you know what, why are we not submitting all the like recommendations and like a request like upfront, like even before the actual meeting happens? Wouldn't it be like so much nicer that like if the board actually took a bit of time to review them early on, like the preparation time you're talking about, right? And then the actual meeting time is actually spent for Q&A, clarification, more brainstorming, new ideas, mostly that, and not reviewing documents and reviewing a presentation in general.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we have to redesign our agendas. And yes, I mean, I think one thing that is pretty common these days is, boards do get information ahead of time. The question is, will they review it? I think we have to give them as much lead time as possible to ensure that they're reviewing things. I think 2 weeks is generally, a standard number. Some organizations do a week, some organizations do a little bit more. I do think that we need to make sure, and that's why I say, the secretary can play a very important role in shaping the way information is shared to make it easier for boards to review that content, right? If we
Mm,
want boards to review the meeting materials, we want to present it in a way that's more interesting. So I think we can do more with online presentations where people can view a presentation. Maybe it's from the CEO, maybe it's from a committee member or committee chair, and they can review it and see, what's being proposed. Maybe there's a single page document that backs up the presentation. The nice thing about that is that they're hearing from someone, they're watching someone, they're listening to someone talk about it. It can bring ideas, it can bring a request or a recommendation to life in a way that a document can't. But you can still have a PDF, if you will, one pager to back up what's being shared in a presentation. I think that we have to move towards dashboards where we're monitoring a small number of key metrics so that we can eliminate a lot of paperwork in terms of financial reports. I think we just have to streamline what's being provided so people can review it. And I agree that we have to redesign our agendas so that time in meetings is not being spent reading things or listening to reports. When I was board chair and I was able to work with the CEO on the agenda, I eliminated anything on the agenda that was about reporting. And what I mean by that is there were still reports, but the reports were submitted ahead of time. All reports were assembled into a single document prepared by the CEO and sent out to the board. And then we would review that. And then the agenda design was such that we were only really ever in a few modes, right? One mode would be discussion mode. Another mode would be learning mode. And then we'd be occasionally in voting mode. But we were never in reporting mode. And the only exception to that was the quarterly financial review. And that's only because we had not yet converted to a dashboard system, which unfortunately I left that board before that got started. But if I had stayed, one of the things that I would have done is ensure that we had a dashboard for the board to review, so they could look at a small number of key metrics and monitor the health of the organization. So if we just take the steps to really shape the information differently, shape the agenda differently, and set expectations that everyone follows, then I think we can begin to address some of the issues that go into the question of, are boards fully performing? And again, we can elevate their performance by giving them a different way of understanding why they're there, right? And other things we can do for them. But But these are some of the foundational things that I think we can do to move the conversation in a better direction.
I'll just throw a wild idea into the mix. So, in our company, we have actually eliminated a lot of meetings by just like recording short Loom videos, like short videos that we share between one another. So, and we have eliminated meetings like between team members and then also like between like our organization and the clients. Do you see there's room for like such like short like video recordings alongside a report or something to share information with the board?
Well, yeah, that's what I mean by an online presentation. I don't think it
Hmm.
becomes something that um, that replaces a meeting. I think we want to use those meetings for a different reason. And so if we can frame up, what the board needs to think about ahead of time in a in an online presentation, then I think that will save some time, save some reading. People can probably watch a 15-minute online presentation, for example, more quickly than they can read a 15-page document. And so, or even a 10-page document. So I think we can adjust that. And yeah, I mean, I think in between meetings, the CEO could say, okay, on a once monthly basis in between meetings, I'm going to do a 5 or 10 minute video that basically tells you where we are, or maybe it's in its context that is added to the top of a dashboard or something like that. The other thing, is I'm always thinking about different ways of approaching agenda design, and I've been sort of kicking around a not fully formed thought yet. I'm still sort of grappling with the dynamics of what it would mean, but I actually think that one of the things we could do as an agenda design approach is to start with the idea that everything that's going to be discussed in the meeting starts on the consent agenda, right? The agenda that we use to approve items by unanimous consent. So every item starts on the consent agenda, and then we establish a practice within the organization where the board members review materials ahead of time and then determine
Hmm.
which items they would like to discuss during the meeting. And then we limit the number of things that can be discussed, and we limit the time associated with those discussions. We ask board members to submit questions ahead of time. And if questions are not submitted on an item, then that item cannot be removed from the consent agenda. So we essentially default to the idea that almost all business is going to be handled by consent, except for those items that are really require a discussion. And that would free up almost all of the rest of the meeting for the long-term conversations that I want them to have around Foresight, right? The long-term conversations around what are the issues affecting our organization. So I'm still kind of kicking around this idea a little bit. It's appealing to me. I think there's a lot of possibilities. We would have to structure it in a certain way, and I want to be sure that I'm putting together, a resource on this that would really help organizations implement it. But I think we can get creative around these sorts of things to try new approaches that will position board conversations in the right way and make the best use of their time and attention in these discussions, as we have them.
Got it. So I want to talk a bit about technology adoption because I think like without technology, we are not going to like expand our organizations or grow in general, particularly like AI and everything that is happening right now. So how would you recommend boards and association executive teams to kind of like adopt technology in the future? Like in the past, I guess like they've been like very slow. The pandemic was a bit of a wake up call, right? But now we are seeing an AI boom. So what is your approach?
Well, let's separate that a little bit out because I think that there are clearly technologies that associations need to consider for their business model right now, right? And many of them already, they're very familiar. Associations would look at having a learning management system. Associations would look at having other kinds of technologies that are mostly focused on value delivery within the context of their business model. And so I think that you're right that during the pandemic, during lockdown, when associations had to really turn quickly from in-person events to something that was virtual, they did not necessarily have everything that they wanted to in terms of technology to be able to move that forward. So they need to better prepare their technology stack, their technology assets in a way where they can be able to provide value in a variety of ways. I think and in that case, I think that generally we want, the staff to come and say, okay, these are the things that we think make the most sense, and we seek your support for that and your advice and counsel on how to move forward. I think when it comes to AI, however, we need a different approach, because right now I think that there's a lot of hype about AI. There's a lot of discussion about what AI provides us. Not enough discussion about the downsides of AI, about the need for an ethical, purposeful, and responsible approach to the adoption of AI. I think boards have got to be very involved in the stewardship question around AI, working very closely with CEOs on how AI is implemented in their organizations. I think it starts with, I just said a moment ago, ethical, purposeful, responsible. I think it starts with, let's make sure we have clarity around our ethical guidelines and guardrails that we have for every issue. Like, I think even before we talk about AI ethics, we have to talk about organizational ethics. What are our ethical red lines? What are the lines we will never cross, no matter what we're talking about as an organization? Where do we stand? Where do we put our flag in the ground as to who we are as an organization? What's our commitment to an ethical purpose in our organization? And that is independent of the technology, right? And then once we have clarity around what we care about ethically in our organization, then we can start to imagine how we would craft our AI ethics and our ethical principles, because we don't want to compromise our overarching ethical principles because technology is cool. That's not a good reason, right? It's not good to adopt technology and therefore compromise our ethics on that basis. What we need to do instead is we need to focus in on the core ethics and then use the core ethics to shape our technology related ethics, especially when it comes to AI. So that's a part of it. That's one part. The other part, or the second part, is this idea of a purposeful approach to this. And for me, the thing that has, I find I'm just not that enthusiastic. I know other people are quite enthusiastic about the idea that AI gives us this ability to be more efficient, to be more productive. And I think I think it's great that we have tools that let us summarize PDFs. I just don't find that a particularly compelling rationale for why an organization should implement AI. I think we've got to have a better idea about how AI is going to help us, again, within the framework of our ethical belief system, is going to help us deliver on our purpose as an organization, something deeper, something more significant. And then I think the responsible part of this has to be, found in how do we ensure, equity of access? How do we ensure, we're addressing issues of bias and discrimination in a real world setting? How do we ensure fairness? How do we ensure the, equitable distribution of the benefits of this? How do we examine the environmental considerations, around this? And then also, how do we document our use of AI so that boards can understand what we're doing? We have technical documentation as well as board documentation. How do we report on what we're doing publicly, like disclose our use of AI and what we're doing, and make sure that everyone understands, how AI is being implemented, giving our members a voice in this, making sure we have their consent for the use of data, protecting that data and so on. So I think that we've got a lot of work to do, and it has to be a collaboration between the board and the CEO, working on this with other stakeholders, with staff, with other contributors. But I think we've got to have a much more involved approach from the board, working with the CEO on the AI question, because I don't think we're, in my view, I really in a place where we want to be just being very haphazard or very, very cavalier, if you will, around our use of AI, because the stakes are simply too high. And there are so many unanswered questions, and we, for directors and officers on boards, this is a matter of fiduciary responsibility. This is a matter of legal exposure, of liability, and there's a whole number of issues that they've got to get comfortable with, including their own understanding of how the AI itself, how AI is, how it works, and how it's being used. So yeah, there's a lot to do there, and I think that we've got to have much more board CEO collaboration around the AI adoption aspect in the way that I described, being ethical, purposeful, and responsible.
All right. I see a lot of familiar faces in the attendee list today. Bruce Rosenthal, for sure, Dean Black, We will take questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, please submit them on the Zoom questions and we will get to them as soon as we can. So with that, I think, Jeff, we're going to get to the audience questions that were submitted before. And I see that we already answered a lot of the questions in our discussion already. So I'll go down the list and see which ones are more interesting and which ones are very popular. So Audi actually asked a question like, what are the top three things you ask of your board directors at each meeting?
Yeah, so I mean, I think I think we can all agree there's a lot more than three.
Yeah.
But I would say that just to make it simple, right, to have a simple way of looking at it to start, right? We can build in more ideas later, but if I were to foundationally say, what are the three things? I would say be prepared, be present, be participatory, right? Those are the three things. You've got to be prepared for the meeting. You've got to do your preparation and come ready to work. You've got to be present in the meeting. Put your phone aside.
Phone.
Put your devices aside. Right. The phones and devices are a huge distraction. Sitting around a table, even as a speaker, when I'm speaking and I see people looking at their phones, I really don't know, what to make of it. Are you not finding me that compelling that you're watching your email? And so we got to put the phones aside. We got to put, so be present in the meeting because everyone else is depending upon you to be present. And that's the thing. Even if you're not mostly concerned about your colleagues, be concerned about yourself. If you're not listening to the conversation well, and then you vote for something, and that vote turns out to be a huge disaster for the organization, you will personally be liable, and you will not be able to say, "Well, I was on my phone at the time." That will not wash, right, in court. So let's make sure we're listening carefully to what's being said. So be prepared, be present, and then be participatory. Do not sit there and listen and not say anything, right? Every director and an officer has agency in the way that the board functions. And we want to make sure that, you're doing something, especially if you're hearing something that is concerning you, you have a responsibility to raise your objection or raise your concern. We need dissent in our boardrooms, and we need people who are willing to dissent in these conversations. So those would be my three suggestions: be prepared, be present, and be participatory.
Right. And I see some more familiar names in the audience. Some are our clients already. If you have any questions, please submit them on Zoom questions. So I see Laurie Green, Rebecca Burns, Rebecca Harris, Sangita Kamble. If you have any questions, please submit them on the Zoom questions or on chat. Now, I guess so this is a very tricky question. So Heather White is asking, how do you engage directors who are not taking their duties seriously?
Well, and I don't mean to laugh because it's a very serious issue, but it's
Yeah.
something that unfortunately comes up more than one would imagine, and disappointingly so. Again, I would say that, and this will not be a satisfying answer, or at least the first part of it probably won't be that satisfying for Heather, because she may be like, well, we're already here, so that doesn't help me, but we still have to talk about it, right? Which is, if we need to know they take their responsibility seriously before they're in the seat, right? Which is why we need to make sure that the conversations are being had ahead of time to address that possible concern. I do have a lot of directors over the years who have come up to me in sessions during breaks and said, this is not what I signed up for. And so we need to address that issue before it ever gets there. I actually have an article that I'm happy to share that was, how to become a fit for purpose association director, that includes six questions that everyone should ask themselves. And it's written from the point of view of someone who is seeking a board seat, but it equally applies to people who are serving on boards now. And it's absolutely a resource that you could share. And it starts with, people have to know their why. Why are you doing this? Why are you choosing to be on the board? And if your why is something like, I want to put it on my resume, or I think it'll help me get a corporate board seat, think again. Have a better why than that. If your why is self-interested and self-referential, then that's not going to be helpful. Now, to the crux of the question that Heather is asking, that's before you get to where Heather is. Where you are now, Heather, what has to happen is the board presiding officer needs to have a conversation with that director, right? That's part of their job. And I don't know if you're the CEO, but the CEO and the board presiding officer, president, chair, whatever the title is, need to sit down with any director who is not taking their role seriously and have a conversation directly with them about why they're not taking their role seriously, right? And if it's obvious to everyone on the board that that's happening, then that's what needs to occur. There needs to be a clear discussion around what is expected, what the expectations are between among those three people, right? And perhaps the president-elect gets involved too because that person's coming next. So that conversation, those three or four people need to get clear on what it is what the role is and what's required. And as I said, board service is voluntary. So if that director doesn't want to do it, then they should be invited to move on, right? And maybe there's another role in the association they can play better suited to their talents. There's no shame in people saying this isn't for me. It's not for everyone. Being as much as I want boards to be as inclusive as possible, and I do, and I want as much diversity on our boards as possible, we also have to understand that board service is not for everyone. It's not a role that everyone feels comfortable playing. And so if after getting there, in all sincerity, they don't want to do it, fine, then step down and let's find you another role and we'll figure out a way for you to contribute that is meaningful for you. And we'll let someone else serve in this capacity. So I think we have to make it easier for people to see that there are alternatives. They don't have to stick it out for 2 or 3 years just because they said they would do it. It's okay to step down. It's okay to move into a different role. But if you're going to be there, you've got to do it well. And that has to be reinforced by the board chair, the presiding officer, and the CEO in conversation with those directors.
And this is something I talk about like in all my sessions in general is that like I think many associations don't decide like soon enough. Like we think that like we are on this trajectory, so we have decided on this path. Like so for the next 1 or 2 years, we are stuck on this path. But in reality, like if you have a board member who's not engaged and who's really not enjoying the role, every additional day he's on the board, actually like you are hurting. The board member is not contributing, and then like your board isn't functioning. So the sooner you can make the decision, and like the better off you will be.
Yes, I completely agree. That there's no point for anyone. Board service shouldn't be about suffering. I mean, I don't know how else to put it, right? We shouldn't be suffering, right? I mean, when I was on a board a few years ago and I saw what was happening on the board, I knew, I was going to serve on the governance committee, but I could tell that this was a place where what I was going to do was not going to really be helpful, and my service was not something that would have been good for the board or for myself. So I stepped down, right? When I was a board chair back about 10 years ago, I actually had served a year as board chair. I could have served another term on the board and another year in the board chair role if I wanted to. But at the end of that first year, evaluating everything that had happened, I concluded that the only reason why I would serve on the board for another term and serve as chair for another year was me, right? Feeding my own ego, making myself feel good, being able to say that I was board chair. And so I went to my CEO and I said, look, I'm thinking seriously about stepping down as chair and from the board entirely. I think I've done all I can do here. I think it's time for other people to serve. And, certainly always help the organization whatever way that I can. But I think fundamentally you need someone else in my seat and someone else serving as chair in the coming year. They tried to talk me out of it. It was very flattering. I wasn't looking for that. I wasn't looking for someone to try to persuade me so I could come back and be a hero. It was a genuine effort, genuine decision on my part. But this just wasn't right for me anymore, And more importantly, it wasn't right for the organization, right? So I actually feel great, even all these years later. I miss that organization. I miss the work that we were doing. But I feel great all these years later that I made that decision because it was in the best interest of the organization. And the organization has done very well all these years without me being around, and other people have retired too. We don't have to be around forever in these roles, and we don't have to do them if it's not something that is best suited to our talents and to what we care about. And if we come to a point where service is no longer what we want in this capacity, it's perfectly fine to move on. So I think that we have a lot of conversations to have to make sure that people make sure that people understand why they're there, what is expected of them, clarity of expectation, and also clarity that there is a pathway out if they do not wish to continue serving.
Right. So Bruce Rosenthal is asking, what do you think is the board's role regarding sponsorship programs, sponsorship strategies overall?
I don't know that the board has any more role in that than really responding to, I think that's a staff, function, in my opinion. Staff should be crafting, what the corporate sponsorship program is. I don't think boards should be involved in recruiting sponsors. I think that's crosses over the line of management. I think that we want staff to be developing a very clear strategy around that. It can be integrated into the overall organizational strategy. But other than that, I think the board needs to stay out of that conversation. It crosses too far over into a staff function. And
Mm,
we want staff to have real clarity around what they're doing. The only exception I would say to that is, are there red flag sponsorship relationships being built? And by that, I mean working with companies that are offering AI. So I think that's one place where it touches on the board's stewardship issue with regard to AI. I do think, obviously, there's fiduciary duties related to the issue of sponsorship, but I think that those can be, the board can ask questions about that. The board doesn't have to be involved in that work to ask questions about it. To say, what does this mean for the board from a fiduciary perspective? Are we entering into any relationships that could be problematic for us? Have we done our due diligence on those things? Those are good questions. Explain the due diligence you've done on particular corporate sponsors and the structure of those relationships and any legalities. Has counsel reviewed all the contracts? These are the questions that I would ask as a director around those things. And again, with the exception around things related to AI, particularly, I would say mostly it is a staff function with board oversight and board contribution to the strategy only at the highest level, and then get
mm.
out of the way and let the staff do its job.
So there's an anonymous question, and it's a very tricky one. So the person is asking, is there one primary ultimate reason that would influence your decision to close an association other than financial?
Well, I mean, I think it's a broad question. Without it's hard to answer in a kind
Yeah.
of context free way. I mean, clearly the number one reason why associations would dissolve, fully dissolve as opposed to be acquired or merger, would be financial, would be a loss of
Mm,
resources, a loss of sort of material resources to be able to operate, or something like illegality that they're talking about
yeah.
financial. If there were illegality,
Yeah.
that would certainly be another issue. I mean, I do think that there is a rationale, and there really should be a rationale, that an organization should consider dissolving itself and reassigning its assets to other organizations when they feel they've done all they can on their purpose, right? I think one of the things that keeps a lot of associations, and even more broadly, I would say a lot of nonprofit organizations functioning, is that they have these very broad mission statements and very broad vision statements, and so therefore they may be able to exist in perpetuity because they'll say, well, we haven't fulfilled our vision yet, we haven't fulfilled our mission yet. And I would say let's have a much clearer um, sense of what our purpose is, right? One idea, one statement that really clarifies why we're here as an organization. What's our, raison d'etre? Nice to bring a little French into it for a Canadian podcast. Please forgive my pronunciation. But what's our reason for being? What's our most important work? And how will we do that ethically? That's one of my next practices, is let's have that one commitment to ethical purpose that we have as an organization. And if we have a commitment to ethical purpose and we feel that we have done all we can do relative to that commitment to ethical purpose, we have a choice. Is there a different commitment to ethical purpose we want to make? Or perhaps it's time for us to consider the alternative, which is maybe we reassign our assets to another organization. But I would say that in the normal course of things, it's going to be financial reasons, loss of financial resources, illegality, or something of that nature, or it's a founder thing. It's an association's been founded by someone, that person can't stand not being a part of the
Mm,
day to day, so maybe they try to figure out a way to pull the plug on it. Um, I do think every association should give consideration to whether how well they are doing relative to their commitment to ethical purpose, their reason for being, and their most important work, and determine if what they're doing is making a real difference in the lives of the stakeholders that they're serving. But it's all just speculation, because in the absence of particulars, it's hard to
yeah.
answer any further than that.
And I guess another reason would be that if there is a major change in the profession, like if the jobs have moved like overseas, like we have seen many manufacturing roles that have like moved overseas like in the past 20 years. So if the profession has had like a major change, like a major transition, that would be another reason I think that you're not actually delivering enough value anymore to the remaining people or whatever the new form of
Yeah.
the profession is.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think that's a good point. I think I could see that being an issue. I would also say that probably in this AI, enabled world, we have to pay close attention to what will happen over the course of the next 120 months as we
Mm,
move into the 2030s in terms of how the introduction of AI into the workforce. And I'm not sitting here, I don't, just to be clear, my concern about AI is about, the risks and harms that are affecting real people today. I'm not worrying about Skynet. I'm not worrying about,
mm,
a jobs apocalypse. Yes, the workforce is going to change, and yes, it could take jobs away. But I don't foresee an immediate, job apocalypse. That's more down,
yeah.
potentially down the road. There may be a long-term thing, but it's really more short-term that I'm concerned about. And so I do think, though, we have to monitor what's going to happen in our industries and professions. And that's part of ethical, responsible, and purposeful and responsible adoption is to make sure we know how AI is affecting what's happening in our industries and professions, because there may come a point in time, to your point, that shift is so significant that we'll want to at least consider whether the association has run its course, or do we want to
Mm,
reconfigure it, or do we want to combine, do we want to merge with another organization, do we want to, what are our choices on the table for something like that? So yes, I mean, I would agree with you that there could be a major disruption, and certainly I think your point is well taken, because I just think of an example from a few years, from about 15, 16 years ago, was an association that could not really see what was happening in its own industry, and it was
mm,
the National Men's Neckwear Association, and the loss of men wearing ties to work, that kept going down and down and down, and they couldn't see it. And this is the best part: on the day they shut down the association, the day they literally turned off the lights and locked the door, which I think was like back in 2008, this was such a big deal that it got onto the front page of the Wall Street Journal and was
wow.
reported on the national news later that night by one of the networks here in the US, that that they apparently did not realize that this was happening until their own members started showing up at their meetings not wearing ties, right? So they were so oblivious to what was going on around them that they failed to see it right up until the point that it was literally right in front of their face, because their own people stopped wearing ties. So that there's a good example of a reason why an association should shut down. And of course, it was shut down by force rather than by choice. But if you lack foresight, and we want to talk about an absence of foresight, there you go. If you lack foresight, then that well could be, your outcome is that someone will be shutting the door, turning off the lights and locking the door for the last time at some point in the future. We don't want that.
All right. So if you have another anonymous question, this is how do we build a culture within a board when the board changes each year? So their board
Yeah.
is changing every year. So how do you
Yeah.
build a culture?
So I don't. Other people talk about board culture. I don't talk about board culture. Culture is not something that is central to my thinking. I focus
Mm,
on practices, right? So I want us to build practices. I want us to build mindsets and practices, and you build practices that have enduring impact in the way things happen. Now, people can say, "Well, that's culture." That's fine. You want to use that term? I don't talk about it that way, because I just find that to be just a little too squishy for me. Boards are
mm,
there to work, right? I want boards to do their work effectively. I want to give them practices that help them do their work, and I want to help them design practices to facilitate their work. The practices are what endure, right? So the duty of foresight, or the idea that there's a commitment to ethical purpose, or the idea that the board has governing intent, reason for, a specific expression for the work it wants to do through stewardship, right? Other practices that we put in place to ensure the work continues over and over again. And then through the onboarding process, once you have new directors, new officers, you put them through onboarding. and they learn those practices, and then they start to implement those practices. That's how you establish continuity within the boards, even though there will be directors who will retire and new directors who will come on. And I've been working with some organizations for a longer period of time, and you can see how those practices that are repeatable and that are implemented over and over again become the basis for forming consistency in the way boards perform. I don't think we should be afraid of the fact. I think we should celebrate the fact that our boards are going to change over every year. There'll be new people. It's an opportunity, not a problem. It's an opportunity for us to ensure that there is consistency and continuity. It's a challenge to every director and officer to internalize the practices and to be good models for their new colleagues when they join the board, to say, you know what, this is what we do. This is how we make it work. Here's the practices here. And for them also, for the new people, for the new directors, to come into the board and say, you know what, I don't understand this. Use their beginner's mind while they still have it, right? Before they get socialized in. Let's capitalize on their beginner's mind, even though they may be experienced in their careers. They're beginners to this particular board. So let's look through their eyes and see what they see. And let's develop the practices that are needed for that. So we get them into the process of understanding how the idea of next practices works. And then we help them build, this is, people often talk about board orientation. For me, board orientation is not an activity, right? Board orientation is what boards do together to understand each other's points of view and develop their common view of things as best they can. There will always be differences of opinion. For me, it's the onboarding process, that onboarding process of getting people prepared so that they can work with one another to build a shared orientation around the issues that they're facing. So for me, that's the way we look at it. I look at it through the lens of practices and the ways the board work together with staff and with committees and other contributors. And that's how we build some consistency into the work over time, even though the people will change.
So Jeff, in general, like when a new board comes into their roles, like it takes them a bit of time to understand the association and the landscape overall, right? Is it a good idea for a board to change every year, you think?
Yes, I do, actually. I think that one of the problems that we see with corporate boards is that there is insufficient refreshment, as they call it in the corporate sector, of boards. Like there's too many people who serve for such a long time. And the idea of term limits is very important. And also, it's just simply not fair think about how long someone serves on a board if they become president, right? Generally speaking, if someone becomes president of the association, they will serve a minimum of 6 years before they get there. Maybe it's 5. Maybe they're lucky and they get to be in the officer rotation before then. But let's say it's 6 years. And then maybe they have to serve 3 or 4 different officer roles before they get to be president, right? They have to serve as secretary, they have to serve as treasurer, they have to serve as president-elect. Maybe there's another one thrown in there. So they have to serve a few officer roles. So now you're talking just conservatively another 3 years. Then you serve a
Yeah.
year as president. Then you serve a year as immediate past. You're now on this board for 11 years. It's too much. It's too long. It's
You're right.
impossible, right? And so no one should have to take that on for such a long time, right? I've been a director in multiple organizations and I've only ever served a maximum of 3 years. And I would serve 6, but I would not do more than that, right? If I wanted to be president in that, I would seek it out ahead of time. And then if it didn't happen, I would serve out my term and then I would leave, right? And so I think that the idea that we're going to have people stay for such a long time, it's too much burden to ask of someone for a voluntary role, right? If we want to talk about, starting to compensate people for their roles, which is something I've proposed, I've written about it, then I'm perfectly fine with that discussion if we want to suggest compensation. But in the absence of that, I think that we do need term limits. And I think we need to ensure that there's diversity, built into our boards. And that's the reason why we get to a place of having rotation on a regular basis. We're refreshing our boards. We're bringing in new voices. We're increasing the diversity of perspectives on our boards. And we are also relieving people of the burden to have to serve for very long periods of time around something that may not, be, yes, if you want to be president, you may be fine with serving, 9 or 10 or 11 years on the board. That may be okay with you. But, it's a lot of work to do over a period of time. And I want to be sure people have the opportunity to exit from that when they're ready, without feeling like they have to continue to do it long past the point at which they feel they can serve well.
That's actually a very good point. That like if the like board membership role is like for 1 year, then some people may choose to come back the following year. It's their choice, right? But like people are not like forced to stay on for too long a time.
Right. Yes. And I think that, because it's voluntary, it's a choice you're making every day. Right.
Mm,
And it's unlike if it's in a corporate board position where you're thinking a lot about the compensation. That's a factor that goes into, especially people who are in that stage of their lives where that's their work, right? They serve on 2 or 3 corporate boards. They get paid for that role, and that's their compensation, for that year, often in a retirement age or something like that. In this sector, in the association sector, that's not the case. And even if we
mm,
did offer compensation, we could never offer compensation on that scale to a director. It would be more like compensation that would be, a statement of the importance of their role, but not something that people could live on, right? We would never do that. It's just not. I just don't see that happening. So, I think that we have to understand the dynamics of this, and we don't want people to feel overwhelmed by the responsibilities over too long a period of time. We want to make sure that their service remains something that is energizing for them, stimulating for them, even if it's challenging, right? Even if it's difficult, at least it's something that they can feel good about, because they're making a contribution to the organization. And let's give them the chance to find ways to exit gracefully when their term ends, or seek another term if they would like to, and then
mm.
leave. I mean, people want to give them those choices rather than expecting they're just going to stay forever. It's just not good it doesn't serve anybody's interests.
Our next question is from Sangira Kamble. So Sangira is asking, is it common to outsource to have a corporate secretary or chief information officer to whom board support is delegated?
Well, I mean, I think the role of the chief information officer inside the association is different, right? Because the CIO is the person on the staff role that is really responsible for establishing, the strategy for how the organization is going to use technology to make information accessible and usable and a source of advantage for the organization, right? So it's that kind of combination of, we have technology, but we also have an information or knowledge strategy for the organization. What I mean here is the board secretary playing a role of chief information
Got it.
officer, where they're
Yeah.
doing something similar, but just for the
Mm,
board, right? Just to clarify. I think that there are more organizations that have corporate secretaries. Sometimes the corporate secretary is also the CEO. So the CEO will have that additional title, which can be useful because corporate secretaries operate under the same fiduciary duties as board members. And so, they have the same duties of care, loyalty, and obedience. So that can be beneficial to have the CEO also be the corporate secretary, even though most CEOs don't vote on boards. They would still have the duties of care, loyalty, and obedience. And so I think you could have the corporate secretary playing a role in this, absolutely. But ultimately, I think you want the board secretary to be the one to drive this kind of conversation, because they are truly a full-fledged peer of other directors on the board. The CEO will always be someone who, even though it's a collaborative relationship, or should be, they'll always be, a staff person on some level. So the
mm.
board secretary plays this role, I think, more effectively with the support of a corporate secretary. And I do think it's a good idea. I can see the question here. I do think it's a good idea for every association to consider having someone play the role of corporate secretary, whether it's the CEO or a staff person working in the CEO's office. Often it's an attorney, someone who has a legal background, so they can assist with the documents of governing, right, bylaws and
Mm.
resolutions and so forth. And but I think it's a useful role to consider today, so that it can be a collaborative relationship with someone who is the ongoing secretary of a legal entity called the association. That's the corporate secretary, and then the person who serves temporarily as the board secretary, and that role will rotate, so that you're always having a new person taking on that responsibility, and then the corporate secretary provides the continuity.
Got it. Got it. So the next question is from Rebecca Barnes. Hi, Rebecca. I see you here. So I think we already answered this question, but this is so important. I would like to focus on this one more time. So Rebecca is asking, how can operations staff maximize board member strategic input when they meet only 6 times per year and therefore very easily lose track of important topics between meetings? I think this is where the 6 times a year came from.
Yeah, I think we've addressed this, already. I
Yeah.
think that it's what I said earlier about making sure that you're looking at this in a holistic way and addressing the issue in that fashion. So yeah, and again, I would say that 6 meetings a year is too many. So I think the issue that I encourage you to address there is try to have fewer meetings, and have the conversations be more focused in between meetings, because really 6 meetings a year means a meeting every other month. There isn't a lot of time in between those meetings for there to be meaningful discussions. So let's space them out more and have fewer meetings, so that you can get meaningful work going on in between. It'll be like, with 6 meetings a year, when would a committee meet? You have to, I suppose you could pre-schedule everything, but it would have to happen sometime in the 30 days between the end of the board meeting, the first board meeting, and the beginning of the next, because you need time for the committee to meet, have a discussion, put together materials, and then submit to the board if you need anything. So it just feels a little too crowded, too many things going on. I think you could manage with fewer meetings.
Alrighty. So Jeff, you and I can talk about this all day, but we're running out of time. So what would be your main one or two takeaways for the audience today?
Well, I think there are so many things. First of all, I guess I'll start with a thank you again to you and to Annika and to Member Lounge podcast for having me, join you today for the first live podcast I've ever done, to be honest. And which is a great way to observe Leap Day, right? So happy Leap Day to everyone out there. I think that's pretty cool. And I actually, before I continue, I do see a question has just come in on the Q&A, which I'd be happy to.
You can take that if you want. Yeah, please.
Yeah.
Right.
So the question that's being asked here is, does a formalization of Foresight processes and obligations signal the death knell for emergent strategy? Some believe in the absence of explicit direct strategy formulation execution processes, emergent strategy can still happen. Will Foresight put an end to this mythology? That's a loaded question, Dean. So I'm not sure how my answer is going to address that, but let me just tell you what I think, which is actually no. I think that what we want, I think what if death knell is such a hard term, but if there's something we want to do away with in associations, and I'm a contrarian, and some people who are on here know me in that way. I think what we want to do away with is the idea of strategy as an exercise in planning. I don't think that our strategic planning approaches have served us very well, nor do I think they will serve us well in the future, because it's simply a mismatch with the environment. And so I think what we need is strategy as a process of learning. And so I think actually if we adopt strategy as a process of learning, where we look at how can we learn with our stakeholders, how can we co-create value with our stakeholders in the next 18, 24, 36 months in that strategy window, then and by the way, if we assign or give that responsibility for strategy making to our younger stakeholders, like every organization I talk to wants to involve its younger people in some meaningful way, right? Everyone's very concerned. How will we get the people who are under 30 involved, or maybe it's under 35, depending on the organization. But whatever that sort of demarcation point is, how do we get those young people involved? Well, here's my response. Get the young people involved by giving them a voice in shaping the future of their organization, right? Help them to get involved in the strategy process. Take that burden off of the board and put it in the place of people who are going to be around, by the way, maybe for the next 30 or 40 years, right? The board generally is composed of people who may not be around. They may only be around for another 10 years, right? 10 or 15 years before they retire, right? So let's put that into the hands of our younger contributors, so they can help shape the future of the organization through strategy in the short term, right? The 36 months window, a strategy window I mentioned. And let's put the board, our most experienced decision makers, our most responsible decision makers, in the place of being the primary stewards who focus their attention on where their profession or industry and association is headed, right? the Foresight horizon, right? The 84 months beyond strategy, right? Let's look toward 2030 and start thinking about that. And if each group is doing its role, by the way, staff would support both sides of that. They can support the strategy making process, they can support the board process, the Foresight process. Then those groups can talk to each other, right? I mean, what a novel idea. Let's get them talking to each other and build a trusted relationship where the Foresight conversation being conducted primarily at the board level informs the strategy making process, and the strategy team or council, whatever you want to call it, comes back to the board with its ideas. And by the way, let's go a little bit further on this and say that what we can do is the board can't do all the heavy lifting of Foresight on its own. They cannot in any way, collect all of the perspectives that might be wanted for Foresight, right? So let's create a Foresight network, perhaps more than one, that looks out further down the future, that brings in diverse perspectives and a variety of contributors from across the organization and from the outside. They do a lot of the heavy lifting of Foresight. They bring those perspectives to the board. They input it and infuse it into what the board is doing. The board can take that information and use it for its own Foresight work. And this way, everyone's playing a role that's very important, making a contribution to the work of the organization. And then they're working together, collaborating with each other to try to understand what the Foresight conversation, what that's revealing, and what the strategy conversation is focused on. And then that way, everyone is able to learn from one another and build the best possible direction in the short term and over the long term. And I think that that's what we want to try to see happen in our organizations. We don't want to ask everyone to carry every burden. We want to sort of distribute those burdens across the different contributors of the organization, because it is a burden, right? It is a burden to say, what should our strategy be? And if it doesn't work, what happens to the organization? It is a burden to say, what could our future look like in 2034? And how do we navigate toward that? So I think for the reasons I've already shared in this conversation, we really want our board focused on that longer term future. We want our younger contributors focused on what's happening now so that they can shape the current situation in a way that helps us lean toward the future. And they can also involve their peers in this discussion. And also, the other benefit of this too, by the way, is that we're preparing future board members, those who are being involved in the strategy making work, will one day become members of the board in all likelihood, right? They will, over time, be better prepared to serve in this capacity. So it includes them, it involves them, they are engaged, to use a word that we've used in this conversation. They are participating, they're making a meaningful contribution, and we are preparing ourselves for future board service, while our most experienced senior decision makers are really having this longer term conversation. And it's not, there's no walls around it. They can cross over, but we keep them separate. They serve different purposes, make different contributions. I think that's the way to look at it. So, Dean, I don't know if that's responsive to your question. I apologize if it is not, but I certainly think that there's a great opportunity here for our organizations to think differently about how this can function. And we have a chance right now to say, let's reject the orthodoxy and instead focus on doing something that could be transformative for our organizations if we're willing to make the effort.
So Dean just typed on chat here, like privately to us, that brilliant, you're the best, Jeff.
Well, thanks, Dean. I appreciate that coming from you, and a longtime friend and colleague in Canada, and I'm very happy that my answer was good for you. So it's not that's not always the case with every answer that I give. So for people that hear what I have to say, so I'm grateful for your response.
Wonderful, yeah. So for the audience, if you have any questions for Jeff, please feel free to reach out to him later on as well. Jeff, how can people connect with you later on?
Yeah, so people, the best way direct email address, jeff@foresightfirst.io. That's the quickest way. I certainly would invite everyone to, if you're not already following me, to connect on LinkedIn. And I have a very easy URL, which is jeffonlinkedin.com. I don't have to have a real long URL that Foresight, that LinkedIn has. So yeah, jeffonlinkedin.com is my LinkedIn address, and feel free to reach out for connections or with questions. And I certainly welcome the opportunity to hear from all of you. And again, I appreciate the chance, Farhad, you and Annika, for having me on the Member Lounge podcast.
Wonderful, Jeff, and thank you so much for joining us. You gave us so many insights, and I'm pretty sure the audience got so many gold nuggets to work on.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful. So that was the episode with Jeff. And like I always say that we learn a lot from this podcast and webinars, but like what really matters is like when you execute these ideas into your organization, unless you start taking action, unless you execute, nothing will happen. So you have to execute, execute, execute. So yeah, so if you are like joining our upcoming webinars, like we actually have like so many events that happen like every month. So we have at least like 2 events that we do every month. We join our featured events. Please do. Oh, my camera just died. I don't know what happened. Yeah, so every so we hold events like every month. So join us on memberlounge.app /events. Just go to memberlounge.app, the website, and there will be like the upcoming events already. So we will wrap up for today. The camera died anyways. So we wish you all the best with your association journey. We will see you on the next event.